Today's lecture is on anatomy and physiology, cardiovascular, blood vessels, and circulation. The outline is as follows. We will talk about types of blood vessels, systemic versus pulmonary circulation, and blood vessels in the circulatory system. There are different types of blood vessels. You have arteries, which function to send blood from the heart. They are a high-pressure system. They have a relatively narrow lumen compared to veins. They have thick walls because they are dealing with a high-pressure system. They have three wall layers: adventitia, media, and intima. They have large amounts of muscle and elastic fiber, and they do not have valves. Veins, on the other hand, send blood back to the heart. They are a low-pressure system. They have a wider lumen than arteries. They have a thinner wall than arteries. They have three layers also: an adventitia, a media, which is thinner than that of an artery, and an intima. They have smaller amounts of muscle than arteries, and they have valves to prevent reflux of blood. You also have capillaries. Their function is to exchange material with tissues, such as oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, minerals. They are a low-pressure system. Their lumen is extremely narrow. It's only about 1 cell wide. Their wall is extremely thin, only a single cell thick, and they only have one layer, the intima, which is basically a single layer of squamous epithelium. They have no muscle, and they have no valves. Let's talk a little bit about blood vessel architecture. There are three layers. There's the intima, which is the endothelium. It's this inner layer right here. You have the media, which is the middle layer. It contains smooth muscle. Note that the media of the artery is thicker than that of the vein. The vein has a thinner media. And then you have the adventitia, which is the outer covering of the vessel. Let's look at how the blood vessels are connected to one another. Arteries carry blood away from the heart to peripheral tissues. The arteries divide into smaller branches until they form capillaries within these tissues. Capillaries then drain into larger vessels, and veins carry blood back towards the heart. Let's talk about capillary exchange and filtration. So on the arterial side of the capillary, there is an exit of fluid since capillary pressure exceeds blood osmotic pressure. During the mid-capillary area, there is no net movement of fluid since capillary pressure and blood osmotic pressure are equal. On the venous side, you actually have re-entry of fluid because capillary pressure is less than blood osmotic pressure. Let's talk about the systemic and pulmonary circulation briefly. Pulmonary circulation. So you have deoxygenated blood pumped to the lungs by pulmonary arteries. You have drainage of oxygenated blood from the lungs by pulmonary veins. This is the only place where arteries carry deoxygenated blood and veins carry oxygenated blood. The systemic circulation, on the other hand, involves pumping oxygenated blood to the peripheral tissues through the arteries. The veins drain deoxygenated blood from peripheral tissues. Let's talk about the systemic blood vessels, the arteries. Here are some main arteries that you should be familiar with. Arteries to the head and neck. You have the common carotid, internal carotid, and external carotid. So on the right, the common carotid comes off the brachiocephalic trunk and bifurcates into the right internal carotid, which goes to the brain, and the external carotid, which feeds the tissues of the head and neck. On the left side, you have the left common carotid coming right off the aortic arch, which again bifurcates into the internal and external carotid. Arteries of the trunk. You have the ascending aorta, the aortic arch, then the aorta descends behind the heart. Descending order gives off the renal arteries and various visceral arteries, such as the celiac artery, superior mesenteric artery, known as the SMA, and inferior mesenteric artery, known as the IMA. Arteries of the upper extremity. So again, on the right, you have the brachiocephalic, which gives off the common carotid, and the subclavian. The subclavian passes into the axilla, traverses the axilla, and becomes the brachial artery. The brachial artery bifurcates into the radial and ulnar artery. On the left side, you have the subclavian coming off the arch of the aorta, which passes through the axilla, becomes the brachial artery, which again bifurcates into the radial and ulnar artery. When I say the word bifurcate, bifurcate means splits in two. Bi is two. Arteries of the pelvis and lower extremity. So you have the descending aorta, which bifurcates into the common iliac artery on the right and left. The common iliac artery on each side bifurcates into the internal iliac and external iliac artery. Then the external iliac artery crosses the inguinal ligament and becomes the femoral artery. The femoral artery exits Hunter's canal and the adductor magnus and becomes the popliteal artery, which courses behind the knee. The popliteal artery then trifurcates into the anterior tibial, posterior tibial, and peroneal arteries. Systemic blood vessels, veins. Veins generally follow the nomenclature of the named arteries because the veins follow the artery. So if you have a brachial artery, you have a brachial vein. There are some exceptions though. You have the superior and inferior vena cava. Superior vena cava drains head and neck and the upper trunk. Inferior vena cava drains everything else. You also have the internal jugular and external jugular vein. The internal jugular vein corresponds to the internal carotid artery. The internal jugular vein drains the brain. The external jugular vein drains the tissues of the head and neck. Also note the cephalic and basilic veins of the upper extremity. These two veins are actually useful in making dialysis grafts for people on dialysis. That's all, folks.